Hey gang, we are in Austin, Texas this morning, and we're at Oakwood Cemetery. Beautiful old historic cemetery here in Austin, big city. A lot of famous people here. But today we're going to visit the grave of someone who's maybe not so famous, but oh, what a terrible story. Axe murders. 1884. There was, we went to New Orleans, the Axeman and other stories. It's the axe murders. And they all happened around the time of Jack the Ripper. Maybe it was a copycat thing, or maybe it was Jack himself, they say. But here they were picking on servant girls, mostly black. Now, you look around here, and I should say you look around at the city. The capital is that way. And it's a very large, Austin's a very large, very sophisticated city. Music. And it's massive. And you think back of the day, 1884, this was just a few little dirt rows and squares. A very small city. And all of a sudden, in 1884, New Year's Eve, December 31st, there would be some terrible things happening. There's a man named Chalmers who was here visiting his brother, and all of a sudden there was banging on his door in the middle of the night right here in Austin. And it was a man. At first he wouldn't open the door, but when he finally did, he saw a man named Spencer. It was the boyfriend of the household servant of his servant. Her name was Molly Smith. And Spencer had blood all over his face. He was in bad shape. Walter Spencer was his name, and he said he'd been attacked in the backyard where the servants' quarters were. He said it was a shadowy man. A man who was sneaking around and then came out of nowhere. He needed help, and Tom Chalmers, well, he took one look at Walter. He said, "You're either drunk or you're exaggerating. Go find a doctor." So Walter, who himself was a black servant, he knew better than to argue with a white man. So he did go to a doctor, and he had his wound patched up, and he went home. But in the morning, the body of Molly Smith, his girlfriend, was found. It was found nearby, covered. She was covered in blood, and it was brutal. They went to her room, of course, the police and the servants' quarters, to investigate. And there in the corner of the room was a blood-covered axe. And as they looked toward the door, they saw this blood-stained handprint. They brought the bloodhounds into the scene, but the bloodhounds were unable to pick up the trail, the scent. There was so much blood splattered all over. Now, of course, the first suspect is Walter Spencer. But he's known around town as this conscientious man, a good man. And they got along great. They got along great. I mean, I'm talking about Molly and Walter. That's what the friends said. Their relationship was a happy one. But there was a previous boyfriend, and they found him, the police, and he was arrested for suspicion of murder. But his alibi checked out, and he was released. They didn't know who did it, and the investigation led nowhere. Now the servants of Austin were scared. They began to sleep at the houses of their employers instead of in the servants' quarters. But nothing else happened, and things calmed down. And things got back to normal. After all, it was a new year, 1885. It was just brought in. January, February, March. And then all of a sudden, servant girls across the city started getting harassed. Rocks thrown through windows, someone shooting pistols through walls. And of course, they wondered, because most of the servants were black, was this a racial thing? Was this racially motivated? But then a German immigrant reported that she was grabbed in the darkness by a man who said, "Your money or your life," and she was hit over the head with something sharp. Could that be related? Fortunately, she screamed, and she screamed so loud that the attacker hesitated, and she seized the moment and escaped. She was lucky. Then a short time later, a cook was awakened. Her doorknob was being shaken violently. Someone was trying to get in. She jumped to the window. She was looking out the window. No one was there. But at near the same time down the street, there were two other young servants. They were also awakened by the same thing. Someone was trying to get in their door. One of them opened the door and stepped outside, and they were grabbed. She screamed, and her employer, who was a man who fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy, came running out with his gun, and he tried to get a shot off, but no luck. The attacker disappeared into the night. Would it stop? No. Two servant girls from Sweden, a change of pace. Clara Strand and Christine Mortensen, they were attacked and seriously hurt. And like the others, it happened in the night. This time it was shots that came through the window, and one of the bullets struck one of the girls in the spine. But they survived. Now racial tensions were getting to a high level. The white citizens blamed the blacks, and the blacks blamed the whites. The blacks said they were being targeted by a deranged white man. Now people were sleeping with furniture blocking their doorways and windows. Some even made charms and necklaces to protect themselves from what they believed to be the killer's evil eye. Well, the killings wouldn't stop there. No. A woman servant named Eliza Shelley. She was next. She would be number 2. She was murdered on May 6th. Her body was found next to the bed where her children slept with her. One of her sons told police that he'd been awakened in the night by a man who told him to go back to sleep. And he told police that his mother had been killed by a black man. But other servants who said they saw the man run away, they said no, he was white. But there was a clue found. An interesting clue. There was a strange, bloody, bare footprint. Fat and large and oddly shaped. And the toes, they didn't all seem to be there. It just looked odd. Later that May, another one would be murdered. Her name, Irene Cross, number 3. She was a black cook, And she was found in her backyard, severely injured. She did live for a few hours after the attack, and the police were desperately trying to find out from her, who did this to you? But sadly, Irene was so severely injured she couldn't even speak, and just after a few hours, she died. Well, now the authorities had to step up the game. It was getting crazy, right? So they hired this detective agency out of Houston called Noble Detective Agency, and they came in, and they weren't having luck. Then they hired the famous Pinkertons. The Pinkertons came in. They put a lot of manpower on it, but they weren't having luck. And of course, they were arresting everybody in sight. Anybody who had idiosyncrasies, anybody who would act weird. And accusations were being made all over the place. They arrested 400 men, mostly black, of course, and you can just imagine how the interrogations went. You could call it torture. Well, time went on. No one was caught. It couldn't get any worse, could it? It was pretty bad. Well, it did get worse. Now it was children. Her name was Mary Ramey. She was only 11 years old. She was murdered. And nearby, a woman named Gracie Vance, a servant, and her husband, Orange Washington. That's 4, 5, and 6. All killed between August and September that same year. Mary Ramey was with her mother when the killer came in. Now it was obvious blacks were being targeted. This had to be something racial. Or maybe not. The women had sharp objects inserted into their ears or skulls, kind of a common denominator. And they had cut or chopped marks from an axe. And again, an interesting clue left behind. Another strange bloody footprint, and for sure, this one only had 4 toes. It was like the other. Well, the year was coming to a close, and then there was another murder. Christmas Eve. 2 murders. 2 white women. Susan Hancock, number 7, and Eula Phillips, number 8. Now, Susan Hancock, her grave is where we walk to right now. They were killed within a few hours of each other. Now the city of Austin was in a frenzy. Men were staying up all night with their guns in their hands. City hired more police officers, and the businesses had a booming trade. They were selling window locks, and the medicine shops were now selling tonics to calm hysterical nerves. Now, the husbands of the women, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock, Moses Hancock was found not guilty. But James Phillips, his trial turned into a massive scandal. Why? Well, he was said to be a drunk. He was said to be abusive. And it is said Eula had to find love in the arms of others. Now, there was a witness who came forward who had a boarding house. It was more of a meeting house. And Eula was going there a lot, meeting men. In fact, just before she was murdered, she was there with a man. So the jury heard all of that, and they convicted him without a second thought. The lawyers were like, just because this was going on and he was like this, it doesn't make him a murderer. We've heard that before. But they didn't care. It was the emotions of the time. But a judge, came to his senses, another judge, and he overturned the case. And he was freed, and still nobody could be caught. Nobody could be arrested. And then, as quickly as these murders started, they stopped. Yes, as I said before, nearly the same time in Birmingham, Alabama, in these years, we talked about New Orleans, all these axe murders, and it would be 3 years later, 1888, Jack the Ripper. And maybe that was a copycat of what was happening in the United States. Well, like the other cases, there were several speculations here in Austin on who the killer or killers were of the servant girls, and historians have centered around four main suspects. Number one, the son of Austin resident Dr. James Given. He was the man who ran the Texas Lunatic Asylum here. And they thought it was his son-in-law because the murder stopped shortly after Given had given him an involuntary commitment to an insane asylum, put him away. Or it could have been a mysterious Malaysian cook, they say, who worked near the scene of the murders and who in 1885 had abruptly told employees that he was planning to relocate to London. Probably a reach. They're probably trying to connect him to Jack the Ripper, but a Malaysian man would really stand out in London. So I don't know about that one. But number three might have been a man named James Maybrick. Speaking of London, a Liverpool cotton merchant up in Scotland that some suspect might have been actually Jack the Ripper, and reportedly he authored a journal confessing to be Jack the Ripper. And it said that he had traveled to the U.S. often and mainly to the South before. He could have been visiting Austin here during the time of the servant girl killings. Maybe he was both killers. Now, the one that I think could be was a man named Nathan Elgin. He was 20 years old, and he had a foot with a missing toe. And interestingly, right when the murder stopped, February 1896, he was dragging a girl from the saloon here in Austin, this rundown dump. And he was dragging her to his brother's house down the street. And of course, you know what he wanted to do. And the police were called, and the deputy came out with another one, and they had a confrontation, and they had to shoot and kill him. And they discovered he had only 4 toes, and they were big. He had big feet. All right, guys, we're near the grave, but we have run into an obstacle, a moat, and it's pretty deep. Well, what do you think? Do we do the unthinkable? Okay. Better get it right. Let's go. 1, 2, 3. Woohoo! All right. Made it. I shouldn't have done that. I'm 66. That was pretty far down. Okay. I know you guys are yelling at me right now. All right, I didn't want to walk around. Here's her grave. And sadly, the good news is the headstone is intact, the original. Always like to see that, but it's just laid down here. And that just tells you she is forgotten. But the cemetery do a good job here. Mother S.C. Hancock, 1840, yep, 1884. Thou lost to sight, to memory dear. Sad. Well, one of the last to be murdered here in Austin. Hopefully they can maybe fix this if anyone sees this from the cemetery. But it's in pretty good shape. You could just straighten that foundation out, place that back on, re-cement this, and they could wire this. They could wire this back on. So, rest in peace to all the women who were murdered here. Rest in peace. All right, guys, I am heading to the next story. I'm heading north. Love Austin, guys. Love Texas. Rest in peace, Susan Hancock. And I'll see you on the next one.